Music is ever-changing, and some albums have shaped the sound and style of their time and have left a lasting impact on the music industry. In this video, we'll look at the best-selling album of each decade, from the 1960s to the 2020s. Let's get started. 1960s. The 1960s was a decade of musical innovation, experimentation, and social change. It was also the decade of rock music and the beginning of the album era. Among the many truly excellent artists and albums of this era, none can match the cultural significance and commercial performance of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. It was the best-selling album of the decade, as it has sold more than 32 million copies worldwide. This album is widely regarded as the first concept album in rock history, as well as one of the first albums to use studio techniques, such as tape loops and sound effects. The album features a diverse range of musical styles and showcasing the Beatles' creativity and versatility. It also features some of their most iconic songs of all time, such as Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, With a Little Help from My Friends, and A Day in the Life. The Beatles became a phenomenon in this decade, dubbed as the British Invasion, as Sgt. Pepper was their true masterpiece. The 1970s. The 1970s was the decade of disco and funk. It was also the decade where progressive rock came into prominence, as the best-selling album of the decade was The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. This album is one of the best-selling albums of all time, with over 58 million copies sold worldwide. It is also one of the most influential albums of all time, as it pioneered the arts of concept albums. The album cover is iconic, as it shows a prism refracting a beam of light into a rainbow. The album features a seamless flow of songs that explore themes of greed, war, and death. It features some of the most memorable songs of all time, such as Money, Time, and Us and Them. The Dark Side of the Moon is a psychedelic rock masterpiece, as it has stood the test of time. The 1980s. The 1980s was a decade of musical innovation, diversity, and globalization. Among the many influential artists and albums of this era, one stood out: Thriller by Michael Jackson, which was the best-selling album of the decade. It is also the best-selling album of all time, with over 66 million copies sold worldwide. It's a very diverse album, with sounds of pop, R&B, rock, and dance music, all fused into a perfect 10-song tracklist. The album has some of the most iconic songs of all time, like Billie Jean, Beat It, and Thriller. It was executively produced by the genius Quincy Jones. The album also gave us the groundbreaking music video for Thriller, which is widely regarded as the best music video of all time. Its popularity has lasted even in the streaming era, as it has a total of 4.1 billion streams on Spotify. Thriller is not only a masterpiece of pop music, but also a pivotal moment in music history. The 1990s. The 1990s was a decade of musical change, rebellion, and diversity. Among the many classic albums of this era, none can match the commercial performance of the Bodyguard soundtrack by Whitney Houston. This album is one of the best-selling albums of all time, with over 55 million copies sold worldwide. It was released as a soundtrack for the movie The Bodyguard, which starred Whitney Houston and Kevin Costner. It was a mediocre movie that is only remembered because of the soundtrack. This soundtrack features iconic songs like I Will Always Love You, I'm Every Woman, and I Have Nothing, and features some of the smoothest and most powerful vocal performances of all time. It is primarily a Whitney Houston album, but it also features songs from artists like Kenny G and Lisa Stansfield. It's an album full of classics, and its legacy lives on. The 2000s. The 2000s was a decade of diversity, as rock, pop, metal, hip-hop, R&B, country, and indie all had their moments in the spotlight. Among the many influential artists and albums of this era, none can match the popularity and impact of The Eminem Show by Eminem. It is the best-selling rap album of all time, with over 37 million copies sold worldwide. The album is a more commercial and less controversial version of his previous album, the Marshall Mathers LP. It features some of Eminem's most iconic songs of all time, like Without Me, Clean Out My Closet, and Superman, and features some of the most witty and provocative lyrics of all time. It is still hugely popular, more than 20 years after its release, as it has been streamed more than 6.2 billion times on Spotify. The Eminem Show is an iconic album that serves as a time capsule for the early 2000s. 2010s. The 2010s is a decade where streaming became king, and the blending of genres became more common than ever. Among the many influential artists and albums of this era, none can match the commercial success of 21 by Adele. At a time where artists had difficulty selling albums, 21 became one of the best-selling albums of all time, with over 51 million copies sold worldwide. It is also one of the most influential albums of the decade, as it popularized the use of personal and emotional themes. The album features some of the most iconic songs of the decade, like Rolling in the Deep, Someone Like You, and Set Fire to the Rain, and it features some of the most powerful and expressive vocals of all time by Adele. It became one of the longest-lasting #1 albums of all time, spending 24 weeks on #1. It is the best-selling album of the 21st century, and appeals to every demographic of music listeners. The 2020s. The 2020s is a decade where streaming became the only thing, and genre began disappearing. Among the many influential artists and albums of this era, none can match the popularity and commercial performance of Un Verano Sin Ti. It was Bad Bunny's defining album, as it is currently the best-selling album of the decade, with 16.8 million copies sold worldwide. The album is a reggaeton modern classic, which is sure to stand the test of time. It features some of Bad Bunny's most iconic songs, like Titi Me Pregunto, Me Porto Bonito, and Ojitos Lindos. The album was a streaming juggernaut, as it has become the most streamed album of all time in just a year and a half, with a total of 15 billion streams on Spotify. Do you think it will maintain its spot by the end of the decade?